These Tales.
Some have noted of late that I haven't been so much talking about politics and surrounding issues. I get some of that out of my system on my Grimstreams channel on YouTube, where I do a little news show thing every Monday morning. But it's also the fact that nothing is really grabbing my attention. These slow-rolling disasters that we have going on, the Trump presidency, the wind-up to the next US election, Brexit here in the UK, there's really nothing to be done about any of them, and nothing particularly interesting has happened or changed in regard to those. So it's not out of cowardice or disinterest that I haven't been talking about these things so much. It's just that unless something new happens, or unless something comes and hits me where I live, so to speak, then it's just not really that interesting to me at the moment. There's no novelty to it, there's no urgency to it, there's no stopping it, whatever it might be. But one thing that did prick my attention was a video by the Telltale channel. Now, Telltale is an ex-Jehovah's Witness, so he presents atheist skeptic material, mostly, sadly, lately, it seems, just reading off from the Friendly Atheist. But this is someone who I began following at the tail end of a more anti-social justice sort of spate in their material, and I've kept listening because he's a self-taught expert on cults, and he's someone who's got away from one, and he often has interesting stuff on his channel. But he's also very much turned against the skeptic, the anti-SJW community, and it's interesting to watch what he's saying and where it mirrors things that I've experienced or that I've seen, and also where we disagree. Such as, for example, he thinks that the anti-social justice warrior movement, whatever you want to call it, doesn't really have any substance to it, that it's as crazy in its own way as others, that it blows things out of all proportion. How you can say that in the situation that we find ourselves in today, with people at companies being forced to read white fragility and to go through all these hoops and jumps and self-flagellations just to keep their job. How you can say all of the anti-SJW community content was nonsense in the context of that, I don't know. Are there people who took it too far? Sure. Was there a lot of hyperbole? Definitely. But I'm noticing this mellowing, almost a defeatism amongst people who I take to be principled skeptics. The Amazing Atheist, for example, he seems to have mellowed on a lot of this stuff. Seems to be stinging a little from betrayals from his audience and so forth, and probing and prodding from his audience, and reasserting his left-wing credentials, but still not really willing to go all the way and buy into what's called the progressive movement, apparently without irony. And this seems to be where the new fractures are. I'm also seeing a lot of people who piggybacked on the success of the skeptic movement and the anti-social justice warrior movement starting to turn on it, even asserting belief in religion, or belief in conspiracy theories, or belief in supernatural phenomena. The less charitable explanation for this would be that they were never sincere. And there are incentives to do this kind of thing. Everyone loves a conversion story. If you used to be a social justice warrior and you turn on them, you will get interviews on PragerU and anywhere else you care to mention. And the same thing will happen in reverse, although to a lesser extent. I mean, the problem for the atheist and skeptic community of old, a new one has sprung up. But the problem was we ran out of religion. We ran out of Christianity to debunk. Every argument has existed for centuries and has long been debunked. If people still believe at this point, it's largely through willful ignorance, or so it would seem. And we pushed the boundaries by criticizing other religions. Paganism, Islam, whatever else. The Judaic religions, of course, all share similar underpinnings, so the debunkings there weren't that different. And other religions, it's just not that difficult. It's the same thing with slightly different phrases. We ran out of things to argue about and debunk. And this was before the flat earth nonsense really took off again. So people began casting around for other things to talk about. Psychic phenomena, ghosts, cryptozoology. You know, a lot of skeptics are people who would love for any of these things to be true or real, but it's in the process of examining them and not compromising our skeptical ideals that we became skeptics in a lot of cases. Disappointment, almost. But we ran out of that. But at the same time, there was this crazy, nonsensical, pseudo-left-wing, pseudo-progressive phenomenon happening. The bedroom feminists, people with crazy ideas about race and gender and so on, but coming from a different place to the usual enemies of old, the right-wing evangelicals, but no less crazy, no less disconnected from reality. And that's where you got the AtheismPlus split. The way I have described it and post hoc understood what happened, why there was a split in New Atheism, is that one set of people were principled skeptics. They were skeptics because that was the best way to discern what was true. That was an epistemology for them, for me, for us, to examine things and see if there was any truth to them. And if there was, we might accept it and incorporate it into our worldview, and if there wasn't, we would mock, deride, and debunk it. You know, that is a principled stance. That is a stance that is striving for objectivity, to test ideas, to test concepts, to elevate those that appeared to be true and to push down those that appeared not to be true, like the more nonsensical extremes of gender ideology and so forth. On the other side, you had the political skeptics. These were people who were anti-religious, not because of any particular real conviction or adherence to skepticism, but rather because it was politically expedient for them to do so. They probably didn't give the God question or any of the other great questions of skepticism that much consideration, but what they saw was that there was an evangelical right wing, and that the things that they wanted, to restrict abortion, to control people in various ways, to ban various forms of media and so on, that was at odds with their political positions, which ran counter to that. And so they seem to have become atheists and skeptics not out of any sort of principle that ideas should be weighed, measured, tested, and found wanting or not, but rather just because it was politically expedient to do so. I know I'm ramming that point home, but I think it's important. And so they were wedded to a lot of these pseudo-progressive, pseudo-left-wing ideas. But they weren't wedded to, and even to attempt, objectivity, to adhere to skepticism, to test ideas with rigor, even when they were ideas that they wanted to be true. And so that is where you got the split. For them it was political. For the more principled skeptics, it wasn't. It was epistemological. How do you discern what's true? Now, there were a lot of grifters and cash-ins on that more insane political and ideological extreme. People who I don't think genuinely necessarily believed what they were saying. But it's hard to discern those from the true believers, certainly. And what I think a lot of us overlooked is that in the blossoming of the anti-SJW movement, there were also a lot of grifters, a lot of true believers, or non-believers, I guess you might say, but also a lot of people that were looking to exploit this surging community that was getting a lot of attention, and as a result of attention, money, until the various apocalypses hit. AtheismPlus became a footnote, at best, in the long tale of skepticism and secularism, but in a sense, they won. Just look at the culture around us. We probably couldn't have nipped it in the bud, but we could have done more and been more effective, but sometimes the zeitgeist is just against you. So, taking this back to the Telltale channel, yeah, I watch or I listen to him quite a lot, and as I say, he started out more of an anti-SJW. Now he seems to have had a deconversion, or a reconversion, if you like, where he's now dismissing all the concerns of what you might call the anti-SJW community. Largely, I think, because of the actions of the grifters and the people who sought to exploit that movement to their own ends, many of whom have been right-wing, which is very strange. It's still very strange to me, because these ideas, these ways of doing things, they're traditionally either liberal or left-wing, or both. See, these concerns aren't bullshit. All we have to do is look out into the world and see that age-old products are being censored, that films are being censored or recontextualized and edited, as though we don't have the good common sense to be able to interpret things in their temporal context, in their sociological context ourselves. But if these things were really so insidious, then the people who are censoring them should be affected by them, shouldn't they? So it isn't bullshit. Or at least it's not all bullshit. There has been a lot of hyperbole and people fixating on things that don't really matter, and a lot of grifting, but it's not all that, and I think he's overlooking that. A fine example of a principled skeptic, and one who would have every reason to be a political skeptic, is Bionic Dance, I think. She has stayed very true to her vision, her mission, very watchable, very fun, good animation skills. She's a lesbian. She has some other issues. These are things that you think would nudge her into being a political skeptic, but she rose above her intersection of identity politics and has stayed true right the way through all of this. If we look at Shoe on Head, she really exploded as an anti-SJW, but I think she was coming from a similar position to mine, as I think you can see in the States. Someone who was left-wing, but horrified at what the left-wing had become, and I think that's still where she is. It's just that the political climate in the States has polarized and shifted so much that she's able to carve out a new political niche for herself, separate to that, though she does still indulge that from time to time. I think she's principled. There are others. Jeff Holiday, for example, I think he's principled. I know that'll make some people snort, but he has refused to go along with the excesses of the anti-SJW trend, and is all the stronger and better for it, I think, moving forward. You know, principle stands out. The same with Wizard of Cause. He was always very stridently left-wing, well, left-wing for an American, and his content, you know, stays the course, is very level-headed and steady. He's still a rational skeptic. You know, he doesn't buy into the excesses, but he still points out the stupidities and how it's distracting from what he and I would rather prioritize, issues of wealth and class and so on. But they were turned on by parts of their audience for staying principled and not just going where the grift was, where the money was, where the trend was. Yeah, but that's laudable. Then there are the grifters and the weirdos and the people that I just don't necessarily understand. Dave Cullen. This is all just my opinion, but I never really trusted Dave Cullen, and that reached a height when he was involved in the abortive Kilroy convention, and then more recently he began to shift even further to the right than he started. I say recently, that's probably a couple of years, but then more recently than that, he is apparently reconverted to a Christian. And that's garnered him a lot of support and attention, and he's also been tied into these alternative social platforms. I think Cullen is just grifting. Or possibly believes in the utility of presenting himself as a believer, or that there is value still in these religious beliefs and so on. But my instinct is that it's a grift with him, because he moves from topic to topic, from fixation to fixation, wherever the money and the attention is. There's Sargon, of course, who started out sort of centre-left from a UK perspective, which would be far left almost from an American perspective, and used to be quite reasonable, but he slid into UKIP. He's still supporting Brexit, even though it's obviously a total disaster. He seems to have either have compromised himself or been compromised. It doesn't feel like there's a principle there, a guiding principle. He's not presenting the same person or the same perspective. And it's not because he's grown or for any particular reason or experience that you can put a finger on. He just seems to have slid that way because that's his niche. That's where he gets rewarded, even with YouTube censorship and so forth. As Dave Rubin, I think he started with a genuine discomfort, but in my humble opinion, he's also grifting, but then he's kind of trapped into that. Tim Pool has followed a similar sort of trajectory to Sargon. I don't think he's entirely to blame, but he just seems to have been nudged and shifted and pulled in a much more right-wing direction. Armoured Skeptic seems to have gone off the rails. A relationship breakup is always difficult, and man, what are you doing? Giving up on Shu. Bad man. But yeah, his material has gotten somewhat unhinged, but I don't get the impression he's grifting. It may just be a joke, but it's still off. And then there's Lauren Southern, who's recently made a return to YouTube, moving towards the centre. Is that genuine? Given her past, it's hard to believe that it's genuine, but it wouldn't be the alpha move to become more moderate in this space, which suggests that perhaps she is being more genuine, or she's trying to look ahead and see where things are going to be in the future. Perhaps she sees the writing on the wall for Trump and that whole movement, and so hopes to maintain an audience by becoming more moderate and acceptable. I think a lot of people underestimate the audience effect. The presumption is always that the YouTube funnel is what takes people to the far right, that it rewards you with more of whatever you're listening to. or watching. And so if you watch a little bit of right-wing content, it will feed you more right-wing content and more extreme right-wing content to hold your attention, to hold your interest. That's the idea anyway. But I think people are underestimating the effect that the audience can have on the content producer, or that the situation can have on the content producer. I don't see someone like Tim Pool, or perhaps Sargon, as being funnels to the far right. Rather, they appear to have been dragged rightward by their audience, because that is where the money was, and they got support for being martyrs, and so they get more support that way by doubling down and becoming more extreme in exactly the same way that the pseudo-progressives and the pseudo-left do, where it's not their identity that they're cashing in on, but it's something else. But it's only cash in on-able because that's where the audience lies. The activated, interested, angry, righteously indignant audience that is willing to put its money where its mouth is. Look at Count Dankula, for example. The guy used to be a communist, right? And he made a joke video and was crucified for it. And so it's understandable why that would create a shift to the right, who at least are pretending to talk about free speech and free expression and those kind of rights, anti-authoritarianism, because this pseudo-progressive, pseudo-left has become very censorious and authoritarian. And that's where the money is for him. He can't hold down a regular job because he was excoriated for a joke. So what choice does he have? And then who is he exposed to? Who is it that reaches out and champions him? Who makes him feel good and important and significant? And who abandons him? Who doesn't talk to him? Who blocks him? What block lists is he populated into? How is he going to be exposed to any other ideas or other points of view? He isn't, really. So it's little wonder that he slid to the right, both for reasons of personal preservation, income, but also just as a result of who he's exposed to, what ideas, what they're saying, even if it's insincere. So are these people grifting, or is it a genuine conversion, deconversion, reconversion? I think it depends on the person. Yeah, there's fertile ground on the right. The left has ceded the ground of freedoms, responsibilities, free speech, free expression, artistic freedom. They don't seem to believe in these things anymore, even though they're quite foundational left-wing values. And the right, while they might be bullshitting, or at least pretending to support these things. When it comes to religion, I think some of these people who were skeptics but have shifted to the right and been absorbed in these ideas of Western culture, whatever that might mean, rather than a loose collection of cultures, they see religion as useful as a tool, something to be used, belief in belief, as Dan Dennett calls it. And there's this weird idea that utopianism is necessarily bad, even though if you shoot for the stars, you might at least land on the moon, which is better than where you started, right? But atheism doesn't have a utopian vision. It just says that things will be better. We will have less problems if we remove this kind of magical thinking that so many people succumb to. Is it really that useful to be divorced from reality? Can that not go wrong? Can the codes that produce Christian charity or Muslim hospitality, can they not also include throwing gay people off buildings or burning witches at the stake? Yeah, what's the cost-benefit analysis here? Can we have the benefits of religion without the obdurate stupidity of religion? It's not a utopia to say that we would be better off without religion. It's just marginally better than things are currently. and holding out the hope of acting on a rational basis. See, it's hard to tell who's grifting and who is looking to survive and who is looking to cash in on this right-wing surge. And the ultimate irony to me is that we acknowledge the effect that commercialism has on the mainstream media or the political views of whoever happens to own them, whether it's Jeff Bezos or Rupert Murdoch, right? We understand that money shifts people's opinions and presentations and what can or cannot be said, shown, observed. And a lot of these people started out as independent media voices and got popular initially as independent media voices. Voices that you weren't seeing on the mainstream. And the idea was that they were not beholden to anyone. But they are beholden to their audiences. And that effect only increases when YouTube stifles the advertising money. When you become reliant on Patreon or Super Chats or other donations, you have to do what pays the bills, especially if you've decided to make YouTube your full-time job. You have to stay controversial, you have to operate in that economy of attention, and removing the advertising revenue from a lot of these people has not caused them to step back or buckle or change their presentation. It has caused them to double down and become more extreme. Equally, cutting them off from opposing points of view by blocking them, muting them, making it so they can't see or interact with your content, even if they are being mean and taking the piss. That means all they're exposed to is more of these same viewpoints, the same kind of echo chamber or echo prison in this case, that affects the crazy people on the pseudo-left as well. You never have your ideas challenged, you never have to defend them. You're only exposed to people who believe the same as you or the same but a little bit more. So little wonder that people shift to the right. That's where the money is. If you've already started leaning that way, that's where the audience is. And that's the kind of people you find yourself in the company of. And it takes a great deal of testicular fortitude to carve your own path, not take the path of least resistance and most money. And I think the grifters I understand. The people who've had genuine conversions I understand. It's the people who cynically exploit things like religion or extremist ideology. That's what bothers me more. So, and I think they're mistaken if they think that religion is useful or we need to go for a more conservative right-wing ideology to preserve the West, because belief in belief is itself dangerous. So I just want to end by quoting, though I've taken some liberties cutting the text apart, by quoting Dan Dennett on belief in belief. So Dennett says, "Sometimes the maintenance of a belief is deemed so important that impressive systems of propaganda are erected and vigorously defended by people who do not in fact share the belief that they think is so important for society to endorse. For instance, imbecile monarchs have been kept on their thrones by widespread conspiracies of oblivion and deception when it has been deemed too socially disruptive to confirm to the populace what everyone suspects. The king is an idiot." Religion offers an extreme case of this. Today, one of the most insistent forces arrayed in opposition to us vocal atheists is the "I'm an atheist but" crowd, who publicly deplore our hostility, our rudeness, which is actually just candour, while privately admitting that we're right. They don't themselves believe in God, but they certainly do believe in belief in God. It's not always easy to tell who just believes in belief, since the actions motivated by believing in belief, while not actually believing in God, are, with the exception of those rare sotto voce confessions, well nigh indistinguishable from the actions of genuine believers, say the prayers, sing the hymns, tithe, proclaim one's allegiance, volunteer for church projects, and so on. We no more need to preserve the myth of God in order to preserve a just and stable society than we need to cling to the gold standard to keep our currency sound. It was a useful crutch, but we've outgrown it. Denmark, according to a recent study, is the sanest, healthiest, happiest, most crime-free nation in the world, and by and large the Danes simply ignore the God issue. We should certainly hope that those who believe in belief are wrong, because belief is waning fast, and the props are beginning to buckle. And I think Dennett's comments are as applicable to populism as they are to religion.
Grimm's Tales. Music by Casket Bound.